Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hi, I'm Paul Louis Metzger. I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, and it's my privilege to interview today Becca Jones, who is the director of counseling and wellness, or student counseling and wellness, or director of student counseling and wellness at Multnomah University. I almost said Mayonnaise University, but Multnomah University right here.
You nailed
in Portland.
it.
So,
yeah.
Well, I kind of did, didn't I? I had to get around and around and around it.
Yeah.
Becca, before coming here, agreed to meet. Now she wishes she hadn't, to discuss the subject that we're dealing with today. But we're sitting down to discuss the subject of Wellness Week at Multnomah University, which is next week.
Yeah.
And then also a theme which I'll come to in a minute, titled Relational Martyrdom. I'm really struck by that theme. And so, Becca, thanks so much for joining me for this interview. So first off, tell us about Wellness Week. What is that?
Yeah, so it's a new week, an emphasis week that we're starting this year. It's just a look at relationships and kind of overall wellness. I think we want to help graduate whole people and educate people beyond just the classroom. So
yeah, whole people. That yeah, we probably all have some sense of what that is, but I think so often the way our society is framed, we don't think about that nearly enough.
Yeah.
We think part people or compartmentalized people.
Absolutely.
Even though it's not part of the script, could you just speak on graduating whole people? Because I like that idea a lot, but what does that mean, graduating whole people?
Yeah, I mean, I think at university we have students in a really interesting time in their lives, a time when they're learning a lot, and I think when we limit that learning just to the intellectual realms of a classroom, I think we've lost kind of an opportunity. So part of that is like, how are they in relationships? How are they, at home? How are they when they speak to themselves? Do they know how to do that well? Do they know how to file taxes? Like all of these kind of realms.
I can't wait for Wellness Week. I want to learn how to talk to myself better. I talk to myself all the time, but I get into fights.
Yeah.
So but no, seriously, those are it's the whole person.
Absolutely.
And graduating a whole person, not a part of a person.
Absolutely.
And I really resonate with that and want to be a part of that.
For sure.
So we mentioned just in passing briefly relational martyrdom. And when you first brought that up, because we're going to work on something together at the conference next week on relational martyrdom, I thought, wow, that is such a great phrase. I wish I had come up with it. You did, and I'll quote you on it. But unpack for us what relational martyrdom means to you.
Yeah, well, what that came out of was just kind of a conversation you and I were having about boundaries. And kind of what we're seeing a lot in dealing with students here, students who are a part of the church, who are oftentimes overextending themselves in relationship because they think they ought to, with this idea of like, if it doesn't hurt in relationships, then it's not a good relationship, Yeah,
and it's if it doesn't, even though relationships involve hurt, it's got to involve hurt for it to be good. It's just like by necessity, right?
Exactly. So that is as the marker of a healthy relationship instead of sometimes the byproduct or the result of a healthy relationship.
Yeah, that's really good. And so somehow or another we're going to deal with that next week, right?
I hope so. That's
or this week, depending on when this video comes out. But it's the matter of it. It's a byproduct, or it's a way in which a healthy relationship may manifest itself, but the relationship doesn't exist for suffering as such.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I was excited to hear your thoughts on that specifically because I've enjoyed some of your thoughts on suffering, and how sometimes we can have a relationship to suffering where we almost idolize it in a way, or I mean that's my interpretation of what you've written. But
yeah, I mean it can easily go that route, and so and because New Wine did a conference on trauma and resilience a couple years ago, and there was just such resonance with people. I think because trauma is like the air we breathe, the water we drink in society in so many ways.
Yeah.
And it can, unfortunately, we can almost get high on it
Yes.
too. I mean, we can in a very disturbing ways. Trauma's there. How do we work through it well, even during Wellness Week with hurt
Yes.
and such? So, having defined relational martyrdom, where it's kind of like, wearing like suffering as a badge of honor. I think we had
Right.
talked about that before. Like,
Yeah.
how much have I suffered for God? I've suffered more than you. I remember competing with a guy in college on who could pray the most, and
Yeah.
and I'd get up 2 hours before dawn, and he'd get up 3 hours before
Mm-hmm.
dawn. So he never slept. He was an insomniac after the time we were done. I forced him over the edge. But and I think we knew the same thing with suffering.
Yes.
You ever seen that Monty Python episode where they're talking about, I was raised poor, and someone else says, I was more poor than you were, and they go through it, and it's like on steroids.
I have it.
It's hilarious. It's well worth it.
Yeah.
But I think we can do the same thing with
Agreed.
suffering, and suffering is certainly key to the Christian faith. The movie Silence by Scorsese really powerfully unpacks that, but the question is how and why,
Yeah.
etc., and is it truly relational or is it something else? So you pointed out on how we need good boundaries.
Yeah.
We need to learn to say no. We shouldn't overextend ourselves. I mean, sometimes God will push us. I mean, certainly Jesus was overextended in ways on the cross. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
my God, why have you forsaken me? He's sweating blood in the garden. But I think it wasn't a daily practice of overextending himself. And God will, at times, take us beyond what we can endure in ourselves, but never apart from what we can endure through him. He always provides a way out in the midst of it. So, but saying no is really difficult, isn't it?
It can be. I
It
think,
can be, yeah.
Yeah, some of that can come from what we learn in our families. Some families tend to be more passive.
Don't think, don't talk, don't feel type of thing.
Don't speak your mind. Sometimes that can be promoted in systems that we're a part of.
What would be an example?
I mean, that can be work, like a job system that maybe needs you to just, buck up and because they don't have resources or they're asking something of you that is beyond what, and there's a power differential and so they don't want you to say no.
A culture of no. Or a culture of just say yes. And so,
yeah.
And, you had said in the conversation before about this theme of, it's so difficult for saying no, to say no at times, that we think, well, then we're being selfish, we're not being generous when we say no, but actually, you said, it might just be the opposite at times.
For sure. I think oftentimes no is an act of generosity. I think no is sometimes something that we can do to preserve a relationship.
So like, for example, if someone says to you, Becca, we need you to, do such and such. I mean, what would be an example? Not that you have to speak about Multnomah or your work here at Multnomah, but somewhere where, someone asks you and you feel like, that really is inappropriate, and you say no. What can you give an example?
Yeah, I think that happens a lot. Like sometimes that happens in my clinical work as a therapist, where a client asks me to do something that's not my role.
Yeah.
You know?
And the projection that can you right? I mean,
Absolutely.
It's like, or they make you into like a messiah figure as a counselor or a parent or someone else, and you have to say, and sometimes it's not easy to discern that.
Right.
Well, and so saying no there can be an act of generosity.
Right, because it can preserve my ability to still be their therapist or to have compassion for them. So if I'm doing something that has crossed a boundary for me, or maybe there isn't a boundary there, but there kind of should be, the result will be that I will feel resentful towards that person.
Yeah. Resentment kills relationships.
It really does. So I'm doing something, but I'm doing it begrudgingly. My motives are maybe to not look rude or to not disappoint you or not be perceived in such a way, but the actual experience is not one of love or generosity. It's one of self-preservation. And so sometimes I think we need to parse that out. Is this truly a place of generosity? And I'm saying yes in this because I can and I'm able to and it fits with my values? Or am I saying yes because I'm afraid? I'm afraid of something.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like I don't want to fail to please someone.
Yeah.
And, I think here of what the apostle said or is recorded as saying in Galatians 1, am I now trying to win the approval of men, or am I still trying, or am I really a servant of Christ? Am I still trying to win the approval of men, or am I really trying to please God? If I'm still trying to receive the approval of men, I'm no longer a servant of Jesus Christ. I think that's really powerful what Paul says, are we seeking to people please or God please? And to people please can cripple them, can cripple us. To care for people is not necessarily the same thing as pleasing people, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I know that.
I think we tend to collapse them.
And I think they're very easy to collapse.
Why is that?
Well, because oftentimes saying no is uncomfortable in the moment. It's kind of, we trade the pain of the short term for the long term, if that makes sense. So like I don't want the discomfort of saying no right now. But what happens is there's discomfort later, I think of that even, I have a toddler, and I have to say no to a lot of things that would be way easier, less tantrums, less resistance in the moment if I just said yes. But what does that do in the long run? And
that isn't easy.
Right.
Again, no and even yes, those are easy words, but how to use them, when to use them for the right, I'm not saying it takes a degree in rocket science, but it's easier in some ways said than done, right?
Yeah, and I think like even in thinking about having this conversation, I was struck by the nuance of it.
Oh yeah, I thought you were going to say I should have said no.
Yes, right? Probably, but it's I think it depends on the person. It depends on the moment. So there's not this like sweeping rule about when to say yes and when to say no. And so I think we want those sometimes, because that would be easier.
Yeah, it's again, I'm looking forward to this conversation next week so I can keep learning how to do this. And so are there other areas besides what you've already articulated on where saying no may be an act of generosity? Maybe it's in our spiritual lives, our vocational lives, our family life, which you've alluded to some of these, but just any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one thought that came to mind was I remember this old like product thing that Apple did. When they were talking, it was like a product launch, with Steve Jobs and the turtleneck, and they did this video where they were talking about the decisions that they made when they were making a product. And they said that we have to understand as an organization that when we say yes to one decision, we're saying no to every other option, right? And I remember thinking about that as somebody who at the time kind of struggled to say no. And realizing that when I was saying yes to something, then that was cutting off my ability to say yes to other things.
Was that liberating?
It was.
Yeah, because you're thinking, actually, I'm doing it all the time anyway.
I'm doing it all the time.
So it's not so hard.
Right.
And I think, if we don't aim at something, such as like learning how to deal with that well, we're going to always miss the mark, or we're going to, if we don't aim at the bar, I don't know what's that old saying, is it you're going to hit it every time? You're not going to hit it? I can't remember those sayings, but just on that matter of learning how to think through that all of our decisions require, when we say yes to something, we're saying no to other things.
Right, and to make some space for that. I also think about like leadership, when I say no to something, an opportunity, who else could come along? Who does that make space for? So thinking about also opportunities to allow other people their voices or perspectives to shine. And thinking too about even relationally, if somebody asks me to do something and I feel like I can't and I say no, maybe that allows for someone else to step up and do that.
I think our Messiah complex tendencies, we think we have to do everything, and it's like, well, actually I think God limited us for reasons to make sure that community is a part of our lives.
For sure.
And the body of Christ is there for a reason. The hand needs the foot, who needs the eye, who needs the ear, etc. So but I think we easily think, and sometimes want, whether we admit to it or not, to really try and do it all.
Right.
And that's not healthy.
Right. And I think that that makes me think of another piece. I remember becoming a mom and a parent. I like my job. Like, I really like my job, and I like my work, and it's good. Like, it fits with my values. It feels like a calling. And so I remember that I was feeling like I was having to say no to something that is good. To say yes to something that felt more important in that moment. And I think that's another reason why saying no can be difficult, is oftentimes we're saying no to things that are not like cut and dry, good and bad.
Yeah, it could be good and gooder.
Yeah,
so
exactly. And so so that can be difficult too. You know, maybe it's saying not now, or not in that way, or you know, the no has to shift in some way.
Yeah, and so there's nuance to it, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be a hard and fast no at every turn. Sometimes it is.
Right.
Jesus with his temptation in the wilderness, it wasn't like, well, maybe later, Satan.
Right.
You know, it was like, no, not now, not ever, never. So yeah, very good. So it's also important for us to figure out and learn when to accept people saying no to us. You know, we've been talking about learning to say no to others or to certain situations. When others tell us no, even when you're thinking about students, working with students, and you're trying to help them, there can be situations where people will not accept no from others, and that's very intrusive, not respectful. Can you speak to that? Because we have been focusing more on the other side. When do we need to? But we need to also learn to accept others' no's, as well as yeses. But
absolutely. And I think that can be difficult. It often feels like rejection, you know? Sometimes asking for something, asking for help, or, you know, for someone to show up for something can feel like a bid for connection.
Yeah.
And so when we experience no, we can sometimes conflate the no to that thing with the no to us.
Yeah. So our identity
yes.
often is bound up with these matters, and
Yeah.
we really want to get into that subject with relational martyrdom. You know, relational boundaries are key for healthy relationships, and unless we have a growing sense of our identity as believers, our identity in Christ, our worth before Christ, and just as people generally, it's very hard for us to come at the boundary issue appropriately.
Yeah.
Would you say?
Yeah.
Would you say so?
Absolutely. I mean, I think how we view that through like the psychology lens is they say boundaries should be rooted in your values. And I think we see that in Jesus. Like in his suffering, he never becomes untethered from the Father. And I think we can do that too, is that can also be a way we can kind of discern some of our boundaries and limits, is if it's costing us that tether.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
So you think of Jesus, you think of the temptation in the wilderness, which, you know, we're moving toward Lent. Some church traditions will celebrate the temptation account early in the year after Epiphany Sunday, early January, but others right around the time of Lent. And, you know, I'm always struck by, I've been thinking a lot about the temptation account of the wilderness and how everything the devil was trying to get Jesus to say yes to meant Jesus saying no to his identity in relationship to the Father.
Yes.
And Jesus was being challenged at every turn to find his identity outside of relationship with the Father. Like, if you're the Son of God, you know, prove it to me if you're the... So it was all about identity. And I think often our temptations and our struggles with yes and no are identity questions. Like, who are we?
Right.
Comes into play. And so you look at the baptism account, which just proceeds in Matthew's Gospel, where this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. I think that shapes Jesus so that when he's engaged with the enemy in the wilderness, he's immune, to quote my friend Dr. Ron Frost, on matters of being immunized to temptation. Said the relational security he has with his Father, which drives him, is what's key. Later in the Gospels, we find, you know, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from him. But the connection at every point is not about the suffering as such, but the relationship to God and to us that drives Jesus. And I think so often we might be driven by the suffering, not by the relationship or in relationship that preserves and promotes healthy identity.
Absolutely, because I think, like you had said before, relationships are suffering. You know, to be in relationship is to say, I am choosing to be burdened by you. You know, and that burden can be so beautiful, but it doesn't have to cost us our identity. It doesn't have to cost us our personhood or our values or our connection to God. And that, I think, is the distinct difference of what I'm seeing. So like when I think of relational martyrdom, what that looks like is a relationship that pulls you off your center in that way. That's asking something that's beyond what you can bear. And I think that we need to be more discerning about that and not supporting of that. Right. Especially in the church, to think about not supporting that in other people. Because,
you know, it's like, well, if you're a Christian, you'll take less. If you're a Christian, you know, it's okay to beat up on you or whatever it might be. Because, you know, basically you're a religious punching bag type of thing.
For sure.
And Christians can do that to one another, right? We can do that. We, you know, wounded people wound others.
For sure.
And so, you know, I think, though, in that context as well, that when we think about relational martyrdom, we may have discussed this previously, like Viktor Frankl, you know, talks about how he couldn't control what the Nazis in the prison camp did to him, but he could control his response. He never lost his centering or his anchor. I think that's so important, is that I couldn't control what they did, because we can't control always what people do. But we can control our response. So there was a sense in which he had a good compass.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Absolutely, and I think shows a really resilient response to something. I think one of my areas where I have seen, dare I say, the church fail at times, or members of the church struggle, is when we can control some of our circumstances. I think what that has looked like is, for instance, you know, women or individuals in domestic violence seeking help from people in the church and being told, like, oh, suffering is a part of relationship, you know, that
keep in that.
Keep in that. Like, you can't control him, but you can control your...
That's right. And that, you know, and that is taking the frank... I'm glad you brought that up, because, you know, these things are so complex. And you know, we can weaponize the Frankl statement against someone, saying, oh, you can't control this, but you can control your response, so it's okay. No?
Absolutely. And I think that that's the example of that true anchor, like in an abusive relationship or in one of those types of toxic relationships, that anchor is not there. And that's, I think, when, you know, not just thinking about, are we tolerating the no, but are we also supporting people in community to say no? And
just stay in the relationship even though it's abusive. And it's like, I mean, there have been situations in the history, like when you think, and again, I wasn't there, but I wasn't there in the first century, where Paul, you know, is dealing with people, you know, submits. Well, they're in a patriarchal society where were they going to go? On the streets? And, you know, and I think we take those texts in those contexts and then maximize them into every context, not accounting for all the nuance. We're not in that context today. One's not having to be in that. I mean, Frankl's statement was all bound up in the context of the concentration. Are we saying that the marriage, it's, you know, we shouldn't challenge a husband, for example, who's really treating the home as like a concentration camp?
Yes.
Hopefully pastors and other leaders aren't thinking that. I cannot imagine Paul going that, just the opposite.
Right. And so I think that that's important for us to know too, like how we're using some of these concepts to promote wellness. You know?
And, you know, again, as a theologian, you talk about wellness, not just parts, but the whole. I mean, theology is often seen as a very rational discipline, and of course it is, but I always like spiritual theology in addition to systematic theology, and historically, those weren't separated, they were one. But I mean, I think this is where theology needs counseling and psychology, because it's a holistic person, requires accounting for various dimensions, and interdisciplinary work is so important. So that's why I'm grateful for your insights and your expertise. So just to play this out a little bit
Yeah.
more, or to think through it a little bit more, we talked as well about, we're talking about relational identity, motives, thinking here of Paul. You know, Paul with Jesus, he said, I want to know Christ, Philippians 3, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. Often in the North American context, in certain situations, it's like an ellipsis. I want to know Christ, ... and the power of his resurrection. No, I want to know Christ in his suffering.
Yes.
But the point is, Paul's not wanting to know the suffering for suffering's sake.
Right.
He's wanting to know Christ. And, you know, when I was married, for richer, for poorer, sickness and in health, you know, till death do us part. You know, it's not the suffering,
Right.
it's the relationship. And good times and bad. And sometimes it is in suffering that one finds deeper meaning. Not that you're seeking the suffering, but you're seeking the relationship in the suffering. I think we easily can mix that up, mess that up.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that then that becomes kind of the motivation or some of the guilt, like false guilt, around pulling out of relationships is because we assume that we're just supposed to feel that way or, you know.
Yeah. If I'm a Christian, I will suffer, and, you know, if I'm not suffering in the moment, then there must be something wrong with my Christianity, because I want to be a macho disciple.
Yeah.
And again, we put the focus on the discipleship and even suffering in discipleship rather than the one who calls us, who is the suffering servant, who is the wounded healer.
Right.
But we sometimes just want the wounding and not the one who is the wounded healer. And so too, 1 Corinthians 13, you know, if I surrender my body to the flames but have not love, I am nothing. It profits me nothing. So it's not suffering as such.
Right.
It's not martyrdom as such, because people can be martyred, but their value system was all distorted. It's again, is this cultivating relationship? And I mean in a meaningful way, and it's the Lord who calls us not to suffer for suffering's sake,
Right.
but that we might become healed in the midst of the wounding.
Yes. And I think a lot of this feels really counterintuitive. That like being boundaried or knowing your limits or saying no to things would make you more compassionate, would make you, would allow you to be more connected or rooted even to Jesus, you know? And so I think like it is uncomfortable and oftentimes not taught, you know, in our homes or in this context, you know, like our churches, whatever. And so, yeah, it can be really confusing. So I'm grateful that you're bringing some of this.
Well, it's mutual. I mean, you're the one who initiated this, and I'm grateful for that. And just as we close off, you know, you think again, like, Jesus was very limited in his humanity. Even though he's God, you know, he could draw from, you know, his divine attributes, but he sought to depend on the Spirit at every turn. And even at times, wanting his followers to be with him, you know, can't you stay awake with me? Or when he's hungry, he eats.
Yes.
When he's thirsty, he drinks. When he's in need of sleep, he sleeps. I mean, there he is in that boat. Storm is blasting, and he's sound asleep because he's exhausted. Elijah, and God deals with Elijah in the suffering. So limitations can be liberating. And that's what you're saying. They're counterintuitive. But we need to see that actually it causes us to trust God more, rely on others more. And maybe not take ourselves too seriously, but God all the more seriously. And so, any closing thoughts, Becca?
Well, I just want to honor the fact that there's nuance to this. That, you know, the discussion about boundaries is one that takes time and intention for each person, and that each person's like limitations and abilities and values are also different, and so boundaries manifest differently. I think that that's just an important piece that I want to highlight, that this is not prescriptive in that way.
Right. And, you know, again, we have not finalized this discussion in any way, shape, or form. We have a long way to go, major journey. I mean, life is that journey. That our whole lives we're learning how to say yes, how to say no, to promote relationship, not martyrdom as such, to move toward a wholeness, not just in graduation from college, but graduation in life until we see Christ face to face. So, Becca Jones, thanks so much. Looking forward to this with Wellness Week and that discussion with relational martyrdom.
Looking forward it.
Yep. Thanks so much for joining Becca and me, Paul, at New Wine Tastings, and talk to you soon.